So for our off-street car parking ratios, is again in response to significant concerns raised by residents and feedback over time about about adverse car parking issues in our residential neighbourhoods. So the Better Housing Amendment includes proposed changes to our off-street car parking ratios, specifically around a number of particular land use types, being multiple dwellings, student accommodation, dual occupancy, and dwelling houses. The car parking ratio changes also focus on the localities included in the Next Generation Neighbourhood Precinct and our urban neighbourhood precinct. Some of the key issues and community feedback and officer investigations have focused on concerns about character and amenity and adverse local neighbourhood road network impacts. Our review has confirmed that there were a number of issues, including the fact that existing ratios don't meet resident and visitor demand. The City of Moreton Bay parking ratios have also been found to be quite low when compared to other Southeast Queensland councils. So for multiple dwellings and student accommodation, the ratios don't reflect a variation in parking due to the number of bedrooms or the number of on-site students or student beds. There's also no requirement for visitor parking for multiple dwelling development currently. And poor or undesirable parking outcomes were observed and observed to be causing adverse character and neighbourhood amenity impacts. So in response to all of these issues and impacts, a specific policy direction has been developed, which forms the basis of our detailed proposed changes in relation to our off-street car parking ratios. This is that new policy is focused on resolving insufficient car parking issues and making sure there'll be enough on-site car parks for both residents and visitors. So I'm just going to take you now through some of the key proposed changes relating to off-street car parking ratios and the intent behind those changes. So for multiple dwellings, current ratios don't adequately reflect demand and don't differentiate for locations outside of but close to a centre or public transport. We've also found that other Southeast Queensland ratios have been based on a sliding scale that increases with the number of bedrooms per dwelling. So the amendment proposes to align ratios with those of Sunshine Coast and Gold Coast councils, as you'll see on screen there, ranging from 1 space per 1 bedroom dwelling through to 2 spaces per 4 bedroom dwelling, and importantly also establish a visitor car parking requirement, which is currently missing. For student accommodation, the current ratio has been identified as an anomaly, as it is based on dwellings and not numbers of students or student beds. So this is actually resulting in a significant undersupply of car parking. The amendment around student accommodation proposes to align ratios with those of Sunshine Coast Council to require 1 space per 2 beds and also establish a staff member car parking requirement. For dual occupancy and dwelling house development, the current ratios in our planning scheme are outliers when they're compared to other Southeast Queensland councils. Other councils commonly align with the Queensland Development Code, or QDC, being sort of the statewide policy basis for these development types. So the amendment, as it relates to dual occupancy and dwelling houses, proposes to align ratios with those of the QDC at 2 spaces per dwelling. The adjusted ratio is considered appropriate as an interim measure in response to our current city context. In terms of questions when relating to our off-street car parking ratio changes, we've had a number. The first one there is what changes are being made to parking minimums? Parking minimums hurt small businesses by meaning they need more land than is often necessary. So just to clarify in relation to that question, the amendment's not proposing to adjust or alter parking minimums associated with small business or commercial orientated development activity. Instead, in response to the concerns raised by residents about sort of undesirable parking issues in our residential neighbourhoods, the scope of the amendment is focusing on interim adjustments to our parking policy and off-street parking ratios for a limited number of residential activities, as I outlined earlier. So those are, again, multiple dwellings, student accommodation, dual occupancy, and dwelling houses. The next question we've had on our off-street car parking ratios is how are alternative transport methods being added to the planning changes? Large developments cannot be allowed to only support cars and large vehicle access. Bikes, buses, and trains should be considered as well. So just in order to sort of consider current and future demand and to look at things like access to public transport and alternative transport methods, Council has recently commenced a more comprehensive off-street car parking study. The study is focused on ensuring that the research justification and the recommendations out of that process are sort of tailored to our specific circumstances. But while the study is underway, the Better Housing Amendment has incorporated sort of targeted and tailored car parking ratio adjustments as more of an interim measure. So really that's in order to respond to residents' concerns and address those undesirable impacts that have arisen in our region's residential neighbourhoods relating to car parking. And then the final question there relates to, is up on slide there, given that other jurisdictions are removing minimum parking requirements and the Southeast Regional Queensland plan, I'm assuming, is looking to set targets for maximum parking requirements. What was the rationale behind increasing the minimum parking requirements for next-gen developments? So in response to that question, the rationale for the proposed changes really does stem from residents' feedback and issues raised over time about those sort of undesirable parking outcomes that are occurring in our neighbourhood. So that's really prompted Council's review. The review has identified that current parking policy for our off-street car parking ratios for those uses that we've discussed is resulting in a parking undersupply, and that's in turn causing adverse amenity and local road network impacts for residents and visitors to these areas. So in particular, Council's parking ratios for dual occupancy and dwelling house development in our next generation neighbourhood police precinct and the transition precinct to the emerging community zone are outliers when compared to other Southeast Queensland councils. And as I said earlier, it's common for councils to be aligning with the QDC being that policy basis, which requires 2 spaces per dwelling instead of the current 1 space.